Afternoon, everyone. My name is Madeline Brosen, and I'm the Associate Director for External Affairs at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. And I want to welcome you to our webinar today, which will be talking about lessons from the sharing economy for the autonomous vehicle future. We have two excellent speakers from two of the four UC ITS campuses. And I'll go ahead and introduce those speakers to you shortly as we get started. Today, our topic will cover parts of both of their research as well to try to explore what this kind of looking back might be about for the future that's to come. As we're kind of getting started and as everyone is joining us on the webinar today, I want to give you a little bit of information about other activities that are happening here at UCLA ITS. On March 9th, Thursday, at this same noon hour, we're going to be having a webinar featuring Martin Wax, who's one of our professors here at UCLA, and he's going to be talking about the California Road User Pilot Program and kind of some insights from how that program's going, as he's part of the technical advisory committee for that. And then as well, this April we'll be having our what we call the Downtown Los Angeles Forum. So connecting to similar topics we're talking about today, we'll think about how we can steer the connected and automated mobility in the right directions. We can try to align what's going on with the in this topic with other transportation policies and plans. So with that, I want to go ahead and introduce both of our speakers and give you their information and then explain how we're going to be going through this hour today. So first we'll hear from Susan Shaheen. Susan is an adjunct professor of civil and environmental engineering and the director of the Innovative Mobility Research at UC Berkeley and within the Institute of Transportation Studies. Susan has served as the Policy and Behavioral Research Program Leader at the California Partners for Advanced Transit and Highways from 2003 to 2007, and also as a Special Assistant to the Director's Office of the California Department of Transportation from 2001 to 2004. Susan will give our first presentation today, and will outline the evolution of mobility sharing, discuss the effects of car sharing on urban mobility, and the potential for reimagining the sharing with the new technology that we're seeing. Following Susan's presentation, we'll actually have our second presenter, Mike Manville, ask Susan some questions and engage in a bit of conversation. And then we'll hear from Mike Manville. Mike Manville is an assistant professor here at UCLA in the Department of Urban Planning, where he received both his master's and PhDs. His research looks at the willingness of people and communities to finance different government services and the tendency of local governments to hide the cost of transportation in the property market. He's particularly interested in land use restrictions intended to fight traffic congestion and how these issues can affect the supply and price of housing as well. So I think we have two excellent presentations today. And so Mike will give a presentation following asking Susan some questions. We'll then bring Susan back, and we will then have some Q&A from the audience as well. So if you are, if you see on the right-hand side of your YouTube screen, there you should see a live chat window. You may need to log in if you're not actually able to put questions there. But at any point during the program, you're welcome to put questions into the live chat box, and we'll draw from those questions at the end as we engage in our presentation. So with that, I want to hand it over to Susan to give our first presentation.
Great, thank you. All right. Hopefully everybody's seeing my screen. I am going to get started. So I'm going to be talking about the future of shared mobility and automated vehicles. This is just a brief presentation overview. First, I'm going to start with a discussion of the sharing economy, and then move into an overview of what we call the shared mobility ecosystem, which is comprised of a lot of different types of mobility that have been emerging over time. Many of them are not new at all, but they've been with us for a long time, but have been increasing in popularity. I'll also talk about the convergence of a number of technologies and what those possible implications and futures might look like. Next, I'll talk about the opportunities and challenges for a future that includes shared, electric, connected, and automated mobility options, and also talk about research and methods and some of the early understanding coming from a lot of the research that's focused on simulation modeling in this space. I'll end with some concluding thoughts about the future of an automated shared mobility service world, and conclude with acknowledgements. This particular slide is an overview of Jeremiah Owang's famous honeycomb figure. And this represents the larger sharing economy. And you can see from the honeycomb that transportation is just one element of this larger sharing economy. Transportation does represent one of the most significant pillars in the sharing economy, but another notable one in terms of its scale, influence, and size is space. And most of you have probably heard about Airbnb and the dramatic changes that this represents to the hotel industry, the housing sector. But there's also other components of the sharing economy, including money, goods, foods, and services. We're going to focus exclusively on the transportation sector today. This slide shows an ecosystem diagram of the space of shared mobility services. And you can see on the left in the orange, part of this Venn diagram represents a lot of those core and incumbent services that have been with us for a really long time. These include services like car rental, public transit, shuttles, taxi services. And to the far right, we see the innovative services that have been moving forward and are enhanced with information technology and wireless services. You see everything from bike sharing to car sharing to microtransit, and then peer-to-peer based models. So services that are not using a dedicated fleet owned by a company, typically, but individuals themselves who are putting their own bikes or private vehicles into these fleets, including what we call ride sourcing or transportation network companies like Lyft and Uber, in which the partner drivers are typically using their own private vehicles. And then in the middle of these two circles, we see carpooling, vanpooling, casual carpooling, which are starting to become more and more innovative due to the ability to link them to this IT infrastructure. What I wanted to share with you here is recently US DOT has issued 2 primers. That ecosystem diagram appears and was created for the shared mobility guidebook, which is on the left. And then to the right is a smartphone applications primer. Both are available for you to download for free. And the shared mobility one in particular has an extensive appendix that goes through the literature with respect to the impacts of these services and our understanding to date. So I highly recommend those as possible resources to anyone who's really interested in this space, and in particular, what the impacts that have been documented of these types of services on the transportation ecosystem itself. So for example, impacts on public transit, impacts on car ownership, impacts on total miles traveled. In the next slide, I feature the idea of a convergence that I think is definitely occurring. And we're hearing more about a lot of these global megatrends. So these things are not just happening here in the United States, but we hear about these types of developments that are happening across the globe. Electrification is coming, and we hear more and more about this every day, how the vehicles and their propulsion systems are changing and evolving. Mobile technologies are deployed globally, worldwide, and are the backbone of a lot of the shared mobility services that we're going to be talking about today. The concept of shared mobility is not new. Some of the understanding associated with it dates back to the 1940s when these services were beginning to be deployed, including car sharing, the idea of a shared vehicle fleet similar to a zip car model that many of you are familiar with. And then there's automation. And today, it seems like this is featured in the news almost every day. And this is the idea that vehicles could ultimately become driverless or highly automated. And we'll also talk a bit more about that. A term here is called SECA, and that was coined by a colleague of ours here in the San Francisco Bay Area, Tim Pompandreo, when he was working for SFMTA, our local transportation authority in San Francisco. And he called it SECA, which stands for Shared Electric Connected and Automated Mobility. Tim, by the way, is now at Google X with Waymo, so we wish him the best, and I want to credit him for the development of that term. In the next slide, I'm featuring a figure that walks us through what NHTSA has now recognized and SAE has recognized is the 5 levels of automation. And what you can see to the right are levels 4 and levels 5. Level 4 is highly automated. So in several use cases, the individual who is behind the wheel, for example, if there is a wheel, would sometimes not have to have their eyes on the road and their hands on the wheel. In some cases, the use cases may grant them the ability to keep their hands off and their eyes off the wheel. Those use cases are going to be specifically defined. We might envision them in shared, automated, low-speed fleet environments, for example, low-speed shuttles, where we may see highly automated vehicles. Level 5 is different from level 4 in that in all cases, in all use cases, that there is no need for a driver and no one is required to have their eyes on the road or their hands on the wheel. And so it's really level 4 and level 5 that we'll be talking about today. The next slide, I wanted to talk again about this convergence of automation with shared mobility and noting in particular those levels 4 and level 5. What I think we're going to see as we look into 2017 and beyond is more of these highly automated or fully automated deployments. At present, there are no large-scale shared automated vehicle deployments, but many companies are in discussions about either highly automated or fully automated deployments. And I think we're going to start to see a number of them soon. Some notable developments in this space include investments by General Motors and Lyft. We're hearing a lot about the automated Bolt coming to market, maybe as soon as 2018. That was a recent announcement. Uber is testing in Pittsburgh a highly automated fleet. New Tesla vehicles are going to be equipped with fully self-driving hardware. We can also download a lot of software to the vehicles that would put them in the level 3 classification. And as you can see in the next bullet, there's a number of automakers that are involved in making strategic investments in this space. And that ecosystem of companies and networks that are looking at this, including tier 1 providers, is just continuing to grow. And we also want to talk about Columbus, Ohio, who won the Smart City Challenge and also has a low-speed automated shuttle in its mix. San Francisco recently won a grant that will include a low-speed automated shuttle on Treasure Island. And there's also a recently funded project in Arizona that will include a low-speed shuttle. So I believe we'll start to see these systems coming to the road quickly. Potential benefits include reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving safety. There's an opportunity to right-size vehicles and include smaller vehicles when it makes sense, and expand to larger vehicles at peak capacity times. There could be increased auto sales as a result of this because of a higher fleet turnover, because their vehicles are in almost constant use, not sitting unused 95% of the time. There could be dramatic reductions in terms of the cost per mile, in contrast to privately owned vehicles. And there's opportunities to add density through redevelopment. So if we don't need all that parking infrastructure to support private vehicles when they come into a city area, for example, perhaps that could be turned over to affordable housing or to parklets. And inherent in all of this discussion is an impact on the privately owned vehicle itself. Can we reduce the footprint of the number of cars households own and rely upon? In terms of challenges, there's quite a few. Upfront vehicle costs, also this idea that are we inducing demand? Are we encouraging more people to drive more and to take more trips because of the lower cost, because of that door-to-door convenience? Might we ultimately erode public transit ridership because of costs and because of convenience? Will people be taking longer commutes? And will these automated vehicles ultimately be deadheading and roaming, looking for passengers? And ultimately, will people give up the private vehicle when faced with an opportunity to subscribe to a mobility service? And finally, I want to talk about these research methods. So there's been a number of studies. Many of them are developing or modifying travel behavior models. A lot of agent-based models are used in this case. Some document prior demographic trends, or others forecast into the future based on expert guidance. Other studies survey potential users to get an understanding of possible impacts. And most of these studies look at an array of scenarios, such as no automated vehicle sharing, just privately owned automated vehicles, shared fleets that don't include pooling, and shared fleets that do include pooling. And what's interesting across the board is that most predict a modal shift away from a privately owned vehicle under specific sharing scenarios. The future impact on total vehicle miles traveled and congestion, however, remains uncertain in a scenario-based environment. So I'd like to conclude with some thoughts. If automated vehicles are shared, will this begin to blur the lines between what is public and private transportation? Most experts are talking about that. SECA could achieve efficient and affordable public transportation that improves access to jobs and healthcare. And we see that in the use cases presented in Columbus, Ohio. SECA also provides an opportunity to fill gaps in the existing public transit network, to provide connectivity to transit, to serve underserved populations and those areas that don't even have public transit. One thing that's really important to take into consideration, and we find this in a lot of the impact analysis work in shared mobility, is that location matters, time of day matters. Cities and sites are going to be different, so the deployment scenarios are going to be different, and we're going to have varying levels of technical, social, and legal context infused into our understanding and deployment in these locations. Pilot programs are inevitably coming, and they're going to be infused most likely by public-private partnerships, and possibly affording us an enriched opportunity to analyze data, because they are public-private partnerships, and pilots are often funded with public sector dollars. What I'd like to conclude with, but I think by far, is this notion that more research in this space is needed, and particularly to inform the policymaking process. So with that, I'd like to conclude my remarks and welcome some questions from my colleague, Mike.
Great. Well, I think, Susan, thank you so much for that presentation, and I have so many questions about automation in particular. I'm going to before I get to sort of the broad questions, I'm just going to ask you a question that I think has just been nagging at me for months now, which is, it's so interesting to me to see firms like Uber and Lyft sort of going whole hog into automation. And on the one hand, this makes sense because there's a company identity that sort of suggests they're at the innovation, they're the forefront of innovation and technology, so of course they want to be involved in this. What I can't quite wrap my head around is that this seems to completely upend their business model. That so much of what, so much of the advantage that you have if you're Uber or Lyft is that you don't own any vehicles. That your employees actually also bring a lot of your capital stock to work with them every day, and they're in charge of maintaining them, they're in charge of keeping them in good condition and so forth, and you as the company can be fairly disembodied and just say, yeah, like we own nothing except software. So I'm just wondering, because I think if I was going to ask anyone this question, I would ask it to you. You might know, why are they doing this? Like, what's the upside for them?
Yeah, so I'm going to disentangle your comments, and I really appreciate them, into, I think, two segments. So one is the fleet itself. Let's talk about that. So when I talked about the ecosystem, there's a major break in that ecosystem between business to consumer markets and peer-to-peer markets.
Okay.
And what we don't know is how many people are going to own these vehicles and want to be making money off of these very expensive vehicles because they're going to be priced much higher, we're hearing, than a traditional vehicle. So there still is a chance that people would be now providing that capital, if you will, or the loan of that vehicle to companies like Uber, Lyft. It could also include car sharing companies. So the idea that it's not a P2P fleet, it's a business to consumer fleet, is not clear.
I see.
And I think in terms of location, the strategy may be different. In some locations, there may not be enough of that capital, and so governments may need to, join in and provide some subsidy and provide those fleets. In other locations, there could be a lot of Teslas out there, although we know Tesla isn't so interested in being on the Uber platform or the Lyft platform. They want to be on their own platform. So I think the market is going to be really fascinating to watch. So why should you do this if you're Uber and Lyft? And I know you know probably a lot about the answer to this because of your personal research. And I think they're chasing this because this is a way to reduce those costs. The cost for them, providing taxi types of services is an expensive proposition. And so if people are going to start using these services day to day for a lot of their trip making, which some people are doing, but I think the vast majority are not.
Right.
They're using these services for specific use cases. Then the cost is really going to have to come down. And with labor, it's really difficult and challenging to do so. And so the automation component, I think, allows that overall cost and liability to come down that's associated with a human-based driver fleet. So I think that's a big answer. And then clearly another answer is the increased safety that is potentially promised by these vehicles. And we know from recent statistics that traffic accidents are increasing. So there's a signal out there that maybe humans are not that good at multitasking when they're using mobile devices to route themselves around. And so I think that's another big answer.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and yes, humans are right now the best drivers we have, but we aren't very good at it. I think we're getting better, we're getting safer, but like you said, the recent uptick in traffic accidents is very troubling. So that brings me to another question, though, and so this is so when we talk about sort of these different levels of automation, and level 5 being sort of the nirvana, right, where you
Yes.
can climb in the back of your car and pour yourself a margarita and then just not think to get there. and level 4 being, if I'm understanding it correctly, something closer to you're sitting there and you're behind the wheel or some device, and most of the time you are not required to do anything, but occasionally the vehicle sends a signal to you that says, hey, you have to take over.
Right.
And so to me, I wonder, one, how far are we from level 5? And how will we know? So I guess a two-part question. How far are we from level 5? And how will we know when we've gotten there, right? Because that's going to require a lot of testing. And then the second question, I guess, is just that if you're not there, like if you're at level 4, there's a part of me that just thinks that might be even more dangerous
Yes.
than a regular human driver, which is to say that, like, I can only imagine myself or some people I know, spending an hour looking out the window and then suddenly having a car being like, take the wheel. It almost seems like until we get straight into level 5, some of these safety benefits might not materialize.
Yeah, I think level 5 is going to be easier to do in some particular types of environments, like a campus community, for example, and low speed. And so I think that's why we've been hearing a lot about these low speed types of shuttles as an early application. And eventually they can be operated outside of level 4. They may get certification to do that very rapidly, or they may not even require it at all. And I think you raise an excellent question, is who is a good enough driver to really do level 4 well? And is it just truck drivers, for example, that would be able to operate between level 4, level 5 operations? Is it a professionally trained driver, or is it all of us? And one of the reasons I raised the issue of the increase in traffic accidents that we've seen, which has been fairly dramatic in just the last 2 years,
Absolutely.
is, are we really ready to be able to operate vehicles in this way? Are we the best ones to do it? And maybe level 4 is for a very highly trained professional driver, if that's the direction we're going. But I think the economics of all of this is really important, and I know you can appreciate this given your background, is, can we scale this if we're just using shuttles?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I would add to that, even if you're just using shuttles or you're just on a campus environment, those aren't the high-risk traffic environments where we really want to improve safety, right? Like, obviously, we want our campuses to be safe, but in general, they are. People drive slowly. There's not a lot of cars. Where we want to see our traffic accidents reduced is in the free-for-all that is our highway system or the downtown. And in some ways, those could be, the last places to get this full-on automation, which does not make it not worthwhile, of course, but I think it sort of tempers, it could temper our expectations that this really is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so then, I'll follow up and then ask the question of, what do you think, if you were running a, San Francisco's Department of Transportation or something like that a city should be doing with automation in mind? And I guess the reason I'm asking that is because if you think about some of the really great advantages that automation is supposed to deliver, right? That people talk about automated cars, and they seem to usually be talking about this bundle of attributes, that it's electrified, it's shared, it's safe, maybe it's also priced because it's shared. And so if you're running the SFMTA or something like that, do you look toward automation to deliver this, or do you kind of look at those other attributes and say, well, there might be ways we can improve all of those right now, even with people's hands being on the wheel, right? Like that a lot of those benefits don't strike me as being intrinsic to having a car that's driverless.
Right.
And so I wonder, how would you say a policymaker right now should balance this desire to kind of maybe enable your city to kind of receive this innovative technology when it arrives, but also realizing that if these are really your goals, maybe there's other things we could be doing.
Yeah, this is a really great question, Mike. We had the pleasure of working with the city of San Francisco on the Smart City Challenge, and we developed a phased strategy that ultimately it took five phases. This was led by Tim Pompandreo, by the way, and the idea was to take all of the existing things that we had in place, start to bundle them, if it was physically or virtually via, say, a mobile device, and start to provide people with an understanding that, hey, we don't have to rely entirely on private owned vehicles. We have a lot of things at our discretion and our disposal. And as technology emerges, we would go through into a second phase, into a third phase. And as we ultimately phased to phase 5, what we really envisioned was that a lot of that parking infrastructure was gone.
Right.
We had affordable housing in place. We had a really well-regulated curb, and we were prioritizing access to that curb. But between, say, phase 1, which is essentially where we are now, where you got a lot of shared mobility options, but they're not necessarily orchestrated on a single platform or through a lot of mobility hubs, say physical locations, how we would slowly evolve towards that larger automated future, taking full advantage of all of the options that San Francisco currently has, including bike lanes and express bus lanes and bike sharing and car sharing and Uber and Lyft, for example.
Right. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. So I think the only other question I really had was the sense that, well, what's the best way to put this? Well, you mentioned that if these cars arrive and they're fully automated, and they're shared, would this really blur the line between sort of public and private mobility? And I wonder, it struck me that you said that, because I wonder do you think Uber and Lyft are already doing that a little bit? I mean, sort of when you get into a Lyft, one of the most striking things is that you're really in someone's personal vehicle, and they've got, like, you might see the picture of their partner or their tennis racket or something. I mean, it's very different than getting on a bus or in a taxi.
Yeah. I think there's a lot that's causing us to have this conversation. That experience, which is really personal, so thanks for raising that. But I think also both Lyft and Uber are doing pilots that are in conjunction with the public transit agencies. And sometimes what we're seeing is even a cross-subsidy over to the user. So there's several different pilots that we could talk about. I don't know if we have time today, that I think are looking at that or really calling this into question is, are these blurring into a quasi-public-private service? And right. I think maybe we're all starting to get used to this idea. For me, I've been a scholar of the sharing economy before it was called the sharing economy. And I think what drew me to it 20 years ago was this notion, right, that we have these assets that are really costly, that are consuming a big part of our incomes, that sit unused and have a lot of capacity, including when we're using them. Most times when we're using them, we're driving alone or driving with one other person per, NHTS statistics, right? And why aren't we using that trunk capacity, for example, to get goods to people? Why aren't we filling those empty seats? And so I think it's almost like we're having this opportunity to start rethinking our whole paradigm by getting in somebody's personal car, but having a private experience, like a taxi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you both so much for this engaging conversation. We're going to let Susan take a break and hear some thoughts from Mike, and then we'll bring her back and keep the conversation going. So, Mike, you're up now.
Great, thank you. So I am not going to use a slide deck. What I was asked by Maddie and the Lewis Center to talk about was more the sort of fairness aspects of shared mobility. I think that the rise of companies like Uber and Lyft, in particular, I think has also brought with it a lot of concerns about how equitable this new arrangement is, who the winners and losers are, and so forth. And I think the first thing to say about that is that we're still sort of learning who is sort of coming out ahead and coming out behind. But I think one point I want to make to start is that the reason, or part of the reason I think that this has become a big concern is not necessarily because fairness and equity problems in mobility or even in shared mobility are a new thing. You know, as Susan mentioned, that the idea of sharing is actually quite old. It goes all the way back to taxi cabs and so forth, and anyone who's familiar with the taxi industry knows that there have always been concerns about how well passengers are treated. There's always been concerns about how well drivers are treated and so forth. I think that's what has thrust this question into the spotlight in recent years, is that part of what's new about the transportation network companies, your Ubers, your Lyfts, and some of their smaller competitors, is that for the first time you have private transportation companies that are national, if not global, right? And this is made for two new things, two features. One is that in the past, you had people who were just less likely to use shared mobility. You know, the taxi cabs have always been in most American cities a kind of a niche market, taken maybe by traveling business people, maybe by some office workers, and then by low-income people disproportionately. And so you didn't have a lot of people who were taking taxis to begin with. And then on top of that, it wasn't, no taxi company ever made the national news, or very rarely did, right? Because they were always, you know, you had a large taxi firm in Chicago that was maybe big in Chicago but nowhere else. And what you have now with Uber and Lyft is a giant tech company, a company that is very much seen as not just a transportation company, or even not even primarily a transportation company, but instead as something that's really at the tip of the spear of technology, and that gets a lot of attention. It gets a lot of attention because it's so big, because a whole host of new people use it, because a whole host of people work for it, right? One of the biggest differences between taxis and the transportation network companies is the demographic or socioeconomic composition of people who drive for it. That 20 years ago or so, when I graduated from college, I knew very few people who came out of my undergraduate who went on to do any work driving a taxi. An undergrad today graduating, you know, probably does know people who drive for Lyfts and TNCs and so forth. And I think that just brings a lot of this to light. And so I guess this is a very long way of saying that in some ways the focus on this is not because the question is new or the issue is new. It's because the high-profile nature of these firms has led us to be more concerned about it. And I'm not sure what that says about us as a society or not. But I think that's a big part of why this is an issue now, as opposed to 10 or 15 years ago. So if we think about who has won or lost from this, you know, from the rise of these shared mobility providers, I think that the first thing you have to observe is that consumers have won. There's almost no doubt about that at this point, that the sheer number of people who take rides using shared mobility providers suggests that these companies right now are providing a service that lots of people value. There have been a couple of estimates, you know, as economists would say, of trying to figure out what the consumer surplus is of companies like Uber and Lyft, which is to say, for the services they're providing, how much more would people have paid to take those rides than they had to pay using the TNCs. And the figures are enormous, especially when you aggregate them up. And you can understand why, because, again, a city's taxi service has been very limited. It was very heavily regulated, and still is in a lot of these cities, that in the handful of large cities where most taxi rides take place, you have these medallion systems that limit the number of vehicles, that limit the kind of prices that can be charged, and so forth. And all of that can translate into a lower quality service. You know, it can be hard to get a cab. You can find that perhaps the taxi won't take you where you want to go and things like that. And Uber and Lyft, for a variety of reasons that we probably don't have time to go into today, are able to circumvent a lot of those regulations and provide a service that that people really value. And so I think unambiguously, consumers have come out ahead. The second question, though, is, well, what about the workers? What about the drivers of these firms, for these firms, so the rider partners, as Uber would call them? On the one hand, they are probably coming out ahead as well. And the reason I say that is that, one, lots of people seem to want to drive for them. The surveys that have been taken of them vary, but generally show a fairly high level of satisfaction. And they do allow what? So we're going to discounts what's happening to their car. They may actually find in 5 or 6 years that their expenses are a lot higher and that they're not coming out ahead.
We're down again.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
How much time do I have? Okay. All right. I guess I'm back. So I think to sort of catch up to where I think I was, I think consumers have definitely benefited. The drivers, it's a little early to tell, but probably they have. The big sort of unambiguous losers, I think, were people who had invested heavily in these big cities in the capital side of the taxi business. That if you owned a taxi medallion in Chicago or Boston or New York or Los Angeles, in recent years you've seen its value decline precipitously, and that's mostly because with the rise of these firms, the quasi-monopoly that you had over providing ride services has fallen. Should we be upset about that? You never like to see someone lose their assets, but at the same time, this was something of a cartel, and the wealth that is being lost there is in fact being transferred primarily to consumers, and so I think that is they are on the wrong side of this, but they I'm not sure from a social welfare perspective that that's a huge equity problem. A fourth group, it would be the people who actually drive for taxis. And this is a more complicated question because, first of all, it's not clear from city to city that the rise of companies like Uber and Lyft have resulted in fewer taxi rides being given, right? It's not clear whether these firms are eating into a kind of fixed pie of rides or if the pool is expanding. But a lot of the evidence suggests the pool is expanding, which in turn suggests that if you're a taxi driver, you might be able to maintain the same standard of living as you had before, your same rough wage, even with this new competition. Furthermore, if the value of a medallion falls, as it might in New York or Chicago or places like that, then the rent you have to pay to use that medallion might also fall. So the real income of taxi drivers could, in the long run, actually go up. It's probably a little too early to tell. So with that sort of said, if that's in fact, if what I'm describing is correct, then why do we have these fairness concerns around the sharing economy or around shared mobility? And I think there's probably a couple different things going on. One is that, again, these very large corporations, and particularly Uber, have gotten a lot of publicity for behaving badly as corporations, or maybe not even behaving badly, but they've gotten some bad press, and whether or not it's accurate, of course, I can't say, but certainly you've heard about Uber doing everything it can to avoid its tax liabilities. You've heard about that perhaps it has a very sexist workplace culture and things like that. Certainly those are huge problems, but they are not intrinsic to the sharing economy. They're just sort of things that sometimes happen that we don't like in large companies. But the other reason is that even if you think about shared mobility in particular, one way to look at it is that this is a system that is making a bunch of people better off, right, in terms of consumers and producers and people who are driving, and at its best, not really making other people worse off, right? But at the same time, there are some people who just can't use it, right? So it's possible that if you don't have a smartphone, or if you don't have a credit card, or perhaps if you have a disability that prohibits you from getting into one of these vehicles, you're locked out of this service. And so even in absolute terms, if you're no worse off than you were before Uber existed, there's a relative decline in your status because there are things that there are new things out there that you can't take advantage of. And I think for a lot of us, we get concerned about that because if we have a gap that widens between most of society and a small group that might be left behind, that is, of course, an equity concern. And somewhat related to that is the possibility that this will actually make some people worse off in an absolute sense. And this is the question of, I just said that I wasn't sure that this would really eat into taxi service and harm the profitability of taxi companies, for drivers. But the fact of the matter is that I could be wrong about that. And if in some cities the rise of these firms sort of wipes out a large portion of the taxi industry, well, then you have a real problem because the taxi industry, because it accepts cash, provides a lot of service to low-income people. And if, in fact, the rise of the TNCs degrades the taxi industry, then you have a real equity problem. And so now I'll just close with a few thoughts on if, given all that, what could we do to make this fairer? And I think that probably the first thing I'll say, since I'm a professor and all professors say this, the first thing to do is do more research and figure out exactly where it is unfair. A lot of what I've said has been fairly speculative, and that's because we don't have very good data on a lot of this. But assuming that some of these issues are legitimate equity problems, I think that there's one of the problems that seems to me that must have a solution is a way to help unbanked people, people without credit cards, access these services. Having said that, I don't know what it is, but it seems like something that with some good minds could probably do that, and that would go a long way to solving this problem of sort of relative deprivation, of opening up these services to folks who right now are locked out of them. I think that in general, we need to pay more attention to the conditions of workers who work in these industries, and when I say that in general because it's become very fashionable to worry about, the benefits and pay of Uber drivers or Lyft drivers, but the fact of the matter is that for a long time, a very poor, often foreign-born workforce that worked for taxi cab companies has also worked in bad conditions. And so I think there need to be probably some across-the-board reforms about what it means to drive for a living and what kind of compensation and benefits people can get. And those benefits, maybe we should decide that those benefits should come from the government rather than private firms. But one way or another, that question has to be settled. And then I think I'll just end with this, it leads to this last point that I'll make, which is that it's important when you're looking at the sharing economy and trying to decide what you could do to make it fairer, to draw a distinction between those aspects, those types of unfairness that we see that are intrinsic to the sharing economy, and those types that are just in the sharing economy because the sharing economy is in our economy writ large. Because in many ways right now, we just don't have a fair economy, period. Right? That I think it's certainly a valid point that very rich people are getting richer and could pay more into social services for lower income people. Those types of reforms would go a long way probably to solving a lot of the problems that we kind of attribute to shared mobility and the sharing economy, but they aren't unique to it. And so with those thoughts, I think, and a final apology for cutting out multiple times on the tech side, I'll close this and see if Susan has any thoughts or questions for me.
This is Madeline again. Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you very much to the audience for being patient with us. We're, we are, as Mike said, technology doesn't always work perfectly, and we're glad that everyone stayed on and we could hear these questions about fairness and other equity concerns. So as we're getting Susan loaded up here, just a reminder that we'll have a couple of minutes at the end for questions. We've had a couple come in, and I'll give those to Mike and Susan, but I'm going to give Susan the first question to Mike.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. And Mike, I really enjoyed your remarks a lot. I think your points about fairness are really timely. There's a lot of questions about the impacts these services are having on existing businesses, drivers of taxis, and just on communities and users. So I wanted to just dig a little bit deeper on a couple of these user groups that come up in our research a lot. We get asked a lot of questions about the socio-demographics of these user groups. And a lot of times what we've found in our research in car sharing over the years and in bike sharing is they tend to look pretty similar in terms of the user bases. So often have a footprint of a well-educated, upwardly mobile person, often living in urban areas, sometimes more on the Caucasian end of the spectrum. This is not always the case. Like one thing we've noticed, I'll add, is that with bike sharing, we started to see that the age of users started to get a little bit older. And we're doing a big study with Lyft and Uber now. We're going to know more about the socio-demographics really soon. But we're often asked this question about, is this sharing economy or shared mobility for everybody? Or is it for a particular sector of society? And how do we mainstream this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that's a really nice way to distill a lot of the concerns. And the first answer, is it for everybody? I think it's right now it's not, right? Because at the very least, you need to have access to the tech and you need to have the credit card. And when you get into the bottom income quintile or the bottom decile, you find a lot of folks don't have one or the other of those. So more often they don't have the access to the credit card. And I suppose, in one sense, where time could solve this problem, right? Because if you look at folks who don't have a smartphone, for instance, they're just overwhelmingly much older people, right? And even they are sort of now starting to adopt them more and more. But the unbanked issue is a big one. And I think from one side of the argument, right, again, you could just say, well, a lot of tech, a lot of innovations when they're first introduced are used disproportionately by higher income people, right? And right now, even with some of the prices being sort of pretty low and I think artificially low, on a per mile basis, these can still be very expensive ways to travel. And so, lower income people are not going to use them quite as much. But I think that, that is, it's part of what's disconcerting, right? It's part of what's disconcerting to see that suddenly higher educated people are the ones sort of taking up the shared travel that used to be a hallmark of lower income people, and disconcerting to see that that's when we start to worry about its fairness, right? That it was sort of so out of sight, out of mind when it was just something that primarily lower income people were doing, driving and riding in taxis and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was really struck by your comment about the consumer surplus, right? Is that people are loving these types of services. and really starting to experience that freedom and flexibility that comes without owning a car that I envisioned many years ago as part of my doctoral work. But the idea of sectors of society being left behind because of disabilities or the age factor or the income factor continues to concern me. And I think it concerns the companies too. I know that both Uber and Lyft have developed concierge type services to help the older folks who might be less comfortable with the technology. But and I think we as academics have a role to play in talking about these fairness issues. And so I really appreciate that you drilled down on that in a notable way. The other population that I think you drilled down on that is noteworthy as well is the incumbent, and how this impacts the incumbent. And I know you and I had an opportunity to do research together a while ago with the Transportation Research Board, where we talked a lot about the role of the taxi. Have you given any thought to how taxis can evolve in light of all of this high-tech development and capitalization, so that they aren't hurt unfairly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that that's a great question. One of the things that this entire explosion of the TNCs has done, somewhat inadvertently, is just sort of throw into much sharper relief the extent to which I think we as transportation scholars and certainly transportation policymakers have kind of neglected taxis. That cities had fallen into this sort of symbiotic relationship with their taxi fleets, where they protected them from competition and extracted a lot of benefits from them and collected a lot of taxes off them. But with some exceptions here, this is a generalization, didn't really think about big fundamental reforms that could make them something that really delivered a great transportation service. And when Uber and Lyft come along, and essentially what they've done in a lot of ways, not all, it's not all of their advantage, is that they're not subject to some of the regulations taxis are. They can use surge pricing to make sure that there's always a car nearby. They can have as many vehicles on the road as they like. They can travel across municipal borders. It's not surprising that people really like them a lot more than cabs. And I think the easiest thing, not that it's an easy thing to do, but maybe the easiest thing to do is to let taxis play by those same rules, right? So it's not so much that the TNCs have to change, it's that they've shown us a way that we could maybe let taxis compete on a level playing field and deliver a better service. And I think if they did that, there's nothing intrinsic about a taxi that says that someone wouldn't take one instead of an Uber.
Yeah, I keep thinking about taxis having new opportunities for growth in assisting elder passengers, for example, and providing, say, that door-to-door service, not just that vehicle door-to-door service, but helping that individual into the vehicle, getting them into that appointment, helping them out. I just am continually struck by the fact that a lot of people are aging in our society and are going to need somebody to assist them if they're going to maintain their independence. And are there ways we can evolve these jobs that create more employment opportunities, increase their hourly wages? These are kind of ideas that I think about, but I don't often work in the labor space. So that's another thought that I have outside of leveling the playing field.
Well, yeah, that's a great thought, and I think it sort of comes back, or it raises this question of professionalizing taxi service to a different level than it is currently professionalized, right? Well, right now we think of it as a professional driver, which of course requires a lot of skill, but to the extent that the taxi starts to fill more of the social service niche, you could imagine the taxi driver being something that's a driver and more of a social service provider. And I think that, it's been a while since I've looked at these statistics, but in a lot of large cities, a very large, or at least non-trivial share of the paratransit trips, you know, are just, they aren't trips that require like a wheelchair-ready vehicle or things like that. It's just like in New York City, for instance, there's a lot of folks who just, they can't get down to a subway stop, right? And so they need paratransit. And there's no reason that more of those trips couldn't be fulfilled by taxis or by Ubers or Lyfts for that matter. Whereas right now, you know, they're fulfilled by the wheelchair-ready vehicles that, you know, probably they could be put to better use, right? And so there's potential here to really make that whole system of providing mobility to people with disabilities a lot more efficient.
And then everybody wins, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the question is, do we want to, are people going to make the decision to go down that path policy-wise, right? Because the potential is also to just kind of drift and go in a different direction. But I think there is a real opportunity to take advantage of this in a way that does advance a lot of equity goals.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, with that, we are out of time. I think that we could all look forward to considering many of these other questions. We had a couple of other questions that came through on the live chat, and we'll see if we can get our presenters to give some shots to that, and we'll send that out with the link for others to share this presentation. So I want to thank everyone who's participated in today's webinar. Really appreciate your patience with our technical difficulties. We look forward to having a couple of these more over the spring. So mark your calendars for March 9th. We'll be joined by Martin Wax. And with that, I want to thank our presenters, Mike and Susan, so much for sharing their time and insight. And thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.